I want you to picture something before we start. A tiny apartment. 2 plastic forks. Cheap noodles going cold on a kitchen counter at almost midnight. A woman who's been on her feet for 12 hours walking through the front door still smiling, because the person she loves is home and that still means something to her. Now hold that image. Because the man in this story eventually traded her, for something he thought was better. And by the time he understood what he'd done, there was nothing left to go back to. This is Alex Caldwell's story. And I'm not telling it because it ends well for him. I'm telling it because the way it ends might make you look at your own life differently. Alex and Clara had the kind of love that makes poverty feel temporary. Not because either of them was delusional about money. They both knew how thin things were. The apartment leaked when it rained. The heater worked on its own schedule. Every time a subway train passed, the kitchen cabinets rattled like applause for a building that had seen better decades. But Clara had a gift. She could make a cramped space feel like somewhere worth being. Not through decoration, they couldn't afford much of that, but through the specific warmth of someone who had decided that wherever you are is home if the right person is in it with you. Alex was an architect. More precisely, he was an architect waiting to become one. He spent most nights at his drafting table working on proposals that never got answered, or sketching designs that lived only in his head and on paper taped to their living room wall. Clara worked at a downtown art gallery. Long shifts, low pay, the kind of job that sounds romantic until you're the one wiping down pedestals at midnight. She worked extra shifts. He didn't ask her to. She just did it, because the bills needed paying and because she believed, with a certainty that embarrassed the universe sometimes, that Alex was going somewhere. One night she came home late, still in her gallery uniform, still smiling despite everything, carrying a paper bag. "Dinner," she said. Alex looked at the clock. Almost midnight. "Clara, you worked another shift again," she cut him off gently. "So did you. Mine required fewer blueprints." That made him laugh. And she unpacked the food, cheap noodles, takeout soup, extra crackers she held up like she was presenting a Michelin star entree. "We're really glamorous," Alex said. "Excuse me," Clara gasped. "This is luxury dining." For a few minutes, sitting on that old couch with knees touching and soup steam rising between them, all the pressure disappeared. The unpaid bills. The rejection emails. The architects who never called back. None of it could reach them inside that small, specific warmth. That's the thing about watching this story unfold, knowing how it ends. The love was real. Whatever happened afterward, and a lot happened, that part was real. And it makes everything else worse. The proposal happened on a sidewalk in the rain. Alex had been planning it for weeks, if planning counts when your budget is what his was. He waited outside a restaurant where they couldn't really afford to eat. Clara arrived 10 minutes late, hair damp from rain, apologizing and laughing at the same time. He dropped to one knee before she could finish the sentence. The whole sidewalk froze. Phones came out. Rain kept falling. He held up a tiny silver ring, cheap, simple, beautiful anyway, and said the truest thing he would say to her for a long time. "I don't have much right now." His voice cracked on the last word. "But I swear to you, one day I'm going to give you the life you deserve." Clara was already crying. "You stayed when things were ugly," he said. "You believed when nobody else did. You built me when I had nothing. And if I ever become anything in this world, it'll be because you loved me first." She threw herself into his arms. The crowd applauded. Cars passed in the rain. And for one perfect, stupid, irreplaceable moment, they looked like two people who were going to be okay. The cruelest thing about that memory is how completely he meant it. A few weeks later, Alex got the invitation that changed everything. A luxury architectural networking gala. Invitation only. Developers, investors, elite firms. The kind of room that could rewrite a career in one conversation. Clara helped him get ready for hours. Adjusted his tie 3 times. Lint rolled his jacket. Kept saying he was going to impress everyone, the way she always said things, not because she was trying to inflate him, but because she genuinely believed it and couldn't imagine hiding that belief. "You coming with me?" he asked at the door. Clara hesitated. She had a gallery shift. She smiled and touched his face. "Go shine." He kissed her forehead and left. Neither of them knew that those two words, "go shine," were the beginning of the end of them. Clara worked the late shift that night at the gallery. An older man came in around 7, well-dressed, unhurried, the kind of person who browsed slowly because he genuinely looked at things rather than just moving through them. He'd been in before, multiple times over the past few weeks. His name was Daniel Mercer. Clara had figured that out on his third visit when another employee mentioned it. Mid-30s, the kind of ease that comes with money that's been there long enough to stop feeling like money. He'd asked her to dinner twice. She'd declined twice politely, with the specific warmth of someone who is genuinely flattered but completely unavailable. "You still haven't said yes," he said that night, adjusting a sculpture display she'd just arranged. "I told you why," Clara said. "You have a fiancé." "Fiancé soon," she corrected softly. They weren't officially there yet, but the ring was coming. She could feel it in the way Alex talked about the future, carefully like it mattered. Daniel studied her face for a moment. "Must be some man." Clara's whole expression changed. Not performed warmth, the real thing. "He is." No hesitation. No complicated pause. No hint of ambivalence hiding underneath the words. Daniel looked at her steadily. "You really love him?" "With everything," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled, a real one, slightly sad at the edges. "Well." He stepped back. "He's a lucky guy." He glanced back once before he left. Clara didn't notice the expression in his eyes. She'd already turned back to the sculpture. This is the kind of detail that matters later, in retrospect. A man who saw her clearly and chose to respect what he saw. Compared to what was happening across the city in a ballroom full of chandeliers, this gallery felt like a different planet. It was. The ballroom was another world. Crystal chandeliers. Champagne towers. The kind of air that costs money just to breathe. Alex felt underdressed the moment he walked in, which was exactly when Victoria Sterling noticed him. She appeared at the top of the staircase like she'd been placed there by a production designer. Black dress, diamond earrings, moving through the room with the specific composure of a woman who has never once waited for anyone. Alex knew her. Or knew of her, which isn't quite the same thing. They'd crossed paths at university, where Victoria was the person everyone circled but nobody quite reached. She'd existed in Alex's memory, less as a person and more as an idea, the life he'd wanted and couldn't access. She walked directly toward him. Stopped close. "Alex Caldwell." The corners of her lips moved slightly. "You actually made it." And something shifted inside him in that moment. Something small. The kind of small that becomes enormous over time. Victoria wasn't warm. She was precise. She didn't compliment people, she assessed them. But when her eyes studied Alex that night, something about the attention felt different from anything Clara's love had ever given him. Clara believed in him through devotion. Victoria believed in him through calculation. And men with unresolved insecurities, men who've spent years feeling unseen by the world, often confuse the two. That confusion would cost him everything. "You know what your problem is, Alex?" Victoria asked later, both of them standing near the ballroom windows with the city spreading out below them. "I have several," he said. "Your biggest one is that you still think talent is enough." The sentence went in deeper than it should have. Because that exact fear had been living in him for years, quiet and persistent, underneath all of Clara's reassurances. Clara loved him in spite of the struggle. Victoria was offering something different. She was offering to end the struggle entirely. "Talent opens doors," Victoria said. "Sacrifice keeps them open." She didn't specify what kind of sacrifice. She didn't need to. That vagueness was part of how she worked. She planted language like seeds and let ambition do the watering. Alex didn't go home that night thinking about betraying Clara. He went home thinking about everything Victoria had said about legacy, about status, about the kind of architecture that gets remembered instead of rejected. He went home and kissed Clara on the forehead while she slept. And the thought he didn't let himself finish was already there, under the surface, beginning to grow. Over the following weeks, Victoria inserted herself into Alex's life with surgical patience. A message here. An invitation there. Private investor dinners. Design consultations. Exclusive events in rooms Alex had no business being in and desperately wanted to stay in. And slowly, Alex changed. The clothes came first. Sharper suits. A designer watch that appeared one day without explanation. Expensive cologne Clara didn't recognize. Then came the way he talked. New vocabulary, new cadence, new way of holding himself that communicated he'd been around different people and absorbed something from them. Clara noticed immediately. She always noticed. That was one of the things he had always loved about her and would eventually find suffocating. The apartment changed along with him, even though nothing in it changed at all. The same leaky ceiling. The same rattling cabinets when the subway passed. But the space between them expanded invisibly, the way cold air expands in winter. The same room, more distance. He came home later. He left earlier. He stopped asking about her day, then stopped talking about his. He sat at his drafting table, but the sketches were different now. Grander, more corporate, the warmth that used to live in his lines replaced by something technically impressive and emotionally empty. Clara noticed the balcony flowers dying first. She waited to see if he'd water them. He didn't. She waited longer. Still nothing. Finally she put them out of their misery herself, quietly, on a Tuesday morning while he was already gone, and she stood there looking at the empty clay pots and thought, without quite letting herself finish the thought, that she should probably pay attention to what that felt like. Dinner together became dinner adjacent. Same kitchen, different schedules. He'd eat before she got home from the gallery, or after she'd already gone to sleep. Their old routine, cheap food, bad television, the specific pleasure of two people doing nothing in comfortable proximity, dissolved so gradually that neither of them announced it was gone. It just stopped happening. And on the rare nights they occupied the same room at the same time, something had shifted in how he listened to her. Or didn't listen. He had the look now of a man whose attention was always partially somewhere else. Mid-conversation his eyes would drift toward his phone. She'd be mid-sentence and he'd nod in a way that told her he hadn't heard the last thing she said. She'd look at him and he'd be physically present and somehow completely absent. She started talking less. Not because she had nothing to say. Because she was tired of talking to a room. One evening she stood in the doorway watching him try on his third jacket before dinner. "You okay?" she asked. "I just want to look professional." "You already do. That's not enough anymore." The words came out before he thought about them. The silence afterward was the kind that changes things. Clara's expression shifted. Not to anger, not yet, but to something more careful, more watchful. "What's happening to you?" she asked quietly. "Nothing's happening. I'm growing." He said it like growth and distance were the same thing. And some part of him already believed they were. Victoria eventually met Clara at a luxury rooftop fundraiser overlooking Manhattan. Alex had pushed Clara to come because investors kept asking why they'd never met his fiancée. Clara arrived in a modest dark red dress, elegant, genuine, beautiful without performing beauty. For one moment, Victoria studied her in silence, and something behind her eyes recalibrated. Not jealousy. Assessment. Because now she understood what Clara actually was. Not just a girlfriend. A foundation. Which, in Victoria's architecture of manipulation, also made her an obstacle. The evening that followed was a masterclass in social erasure, and it was so precisely done that Alex barely noticed it was happening. Victoria positioned Clara outside conversations without ever being rude. When Clara tried to contribute, someone naturally cut across her. When she spoke, Victoria redirected the room's attention back toward Alex. The investors talked around her. The women looked through her. And Clara, who was observant enough to feel every bit of it, became quieter and quieter until she'd essentially disappeared from her own engagement. Later that night, walking home, Clara asked, "Do they make you feel important?" "They respect ambition," Alex said. "And I don't." "That's not what I said. But it's what you meant." He snapped at her then. Raised his voice in a way he never used to. And while he felt guilty about it immediately, he noticed something disturbing in himself a few seconds later. The guilt was brief. Shorter than it used to be. Like a muscle he'd been using less and less, slowly losing its tone. Then came the hidden phone. Clara found it the night she was done pretending not to notice. Alex had come home late again, exhausted, bringing the faint trace of expensive perfume that wasn't hers. He kissed her forehead absent-mindedly and walked to the bedroom without asking how her day was. Clara stood in the kitchen for a while. Then she searched his jacket. The phone was in the inner pocket. Password locked, but notifications still visible on the screen. Victoria Sterling. Multiple messages. Late calls. And one text that made Clara's chest go cold. "You're becoming exactly who I thought you'd become." She stared at that sentence for a long time in the dark. And something shifted inside her that night. Not heartbreak. Not yet. Something colder and more useful. Awareness. The kind that stops waiting to be proven wrong and starts looking for the full picture. She put the phone back exactly where she found it. Walked to the bedroom. Lay down beside him in the dark. Alex was already asleep. He'd gotten good at that lately, disconnecting from the apartment the moment he got home, scrolling until his eyes closed, falling into whatever sleep felt like when your conscience has been quieted by enough validation and expensive whiskey. He didn't notice she was awake. He didn't notice much about her anymore. Clara stared at the ceiling for a long time. She thought about the early days. About the two of them splitting one takeout meal and calling it a good night. About how Alex used to reach for her hand instinctively when they walked, like he needed the contact, like she was the thing that grounded him to something real. He hadn't done that in months. She could have walked beside him through a hurricane and his hand wouldn't have moved. She thought about the perfume. The way he'd kissed her forehead while smelling like someone else's evening, the absent-mindedness of it worse than any anger would have been, because it meant he hadn't even bothered to feel guilty. Guilt requires awareness. He was past awareness. She thought about Victoria. The way Victoria had said, "adorable," at that fundraiser dinner. The word that sounds like a compliment until it lands, and then you realize it's a way of making you small in front of an audience without giving anyone anything concrete to object to. Victoria was extraordinary at that. At making damage look like nothing. And Clara thought about what it means when someone damages you that precisely. You don't do that by accident. You do that because you've done it before and you know exactly where to press. She said nothing in the morning. And that silence, the specific silence of an intelligent woman who has stopped hoping and started thinking, is always more dangerous than screaming. The next morning, Clara opened her laptop. She typed Victoria Sterling's name into a search engine and spent an hour going through everything that came up. Magazines. Business profiles. Charity appearances. All of it polished and perfect until she reached page 6. A small article buried in older archives, the kind that gets buried on purpose. Former Sterling associate accuses Victoria Sterling of manipulating executive divorce during acquisition scandal. Clara read it twice. An architect, married, ambitious, newly recruited by Victoria. Marriage collapsed within months. Career destroyed shortly after. The wife disappeared from public life. Victoria denied any involvement. The case was quietly resolved. No consequences. Clara kept reading. And the pattern that emerged made her blood cool steadily, degree by degree. Victoria had done this before. Not an affair. something more calculated than that. She identified men at the precise edge of their ambition. Men who were talented enough to be useful but insecure enough to be managed. She got close to them through access and validation. And then she used their emotional vulnerabilities to extract whatever she actually wanted. Deals, connections, data, leverage, before the men even realized the transaction had taken place. Their wives and partners, invariably, became collateral. Clara sat back in her chair. This wasn't jealousy she was dealing with. This was strategy. And suddenly the last several months reorganized themselves into something that made a different kind of terrible sense. She closed the laptop, made coffee, thought for a very long time. Then she made a phone call. Not to Alex. Not to a friend. To her father. The Sterling Urban Legacy Gala arrived 3 weeks later, billed as the most exclusive event of the season. 200 guests. Developers. Political donors. Media executives. And Alex Caldwell's name on the invitation beside Victoria Sterling's, publicly, formally, presented as her professional equal and implied romantic partner. Clara agreed to attend. Alex seemed almost surprised when she said yes. He'd half expected a fight. He got something worse, her calm agreement and the specific warmth of a woman who has already made her peace with something. Inside the ballroom, everything glittered. Alex transformed the moment he entered, posture changing, smile sharpening, voice dropping half a register. The performing version of himself that Clara had been watching replaced the real one, now fully on display. Victoria made her way to the stage and did something Alex didn't anticipate. She called him up. Publicly. Presented him to the room as a visionary, a talent, the future of urban design. The ballroom filled with applause. Cameras flashed. Investors nodded. And Alex stood at the microphone, drunk on all of it in the specific way that people get drunk on things they've been starving for. Then Victoria asked him a question. Tell us, Alex, what's the greatest sacrifice success has demanded from you? The room went quiet. Alex laughed awkwardly at first. His eyes found Clara across the ballroom. One glance, 1 second, one last moment where he could have said anything true. He didn't. Love is beautiful, he said slowly, into the microphone. The room leaned in. But love doesn't build empires. Clara stopped breathing. Alex kept going, because the applause was building, because Victoria was watching with that measured, almost smile, because the hunger had fully replaced whatever used to live in the space where his conscience worked. Sometimes people outgrow emotional limitations, he said. No matter how much history you have with someone, you can't stay small forever just to protect their feelings. The sentence echoed across the ballroom. Complete silence followed it. Clara stood absolutely still beneath the chandeliers. She didn't cry. She didn't confront him. She didn't give Victoria the satisfaction of watching her fall apart publicly. She picked up her purse, walked toward the exit with her head up, and at the door, she stopped and looked back at Alex one final time, long enough for him to see everything clearly. Then she said, quietly enough that only he could hear, I hope she was worth it. And she was gone. After that night, Alex told himself things would stabilize. That he'd made a choice and the choice would eventually feel right. That the price had been steep, but the outcome was what he'd worked for. The outcome lasted about 3 months. It started unraveling the afternoon he walked into Sterling Global headquarters early and found himself staring at an ownership chart on a conference room screen. Sterling Global Holdings, 72% controlling interest. Alex Caldwell, 8%. His name, his vision, his work, and he owned barely enough to make a rounding error. Victoria entered behind him. You said we were partners, he said. We are. He pointed at the screen. That says you own almost everything. Of course I do, she said, without blinking. I have the infrastructure, the connections, the financing, the media campaigns. Her voice stayed perfectly level, the way it always did. You think vision alone builds empires? The exact sentence she'd used to seduce his ambition, now revealed as the frame of a trap. He thought about Clara. About how many times Clara had said, gently, "Read everything before you sign anything." He hadn't listened because listening felt like doubt, and he'd needed to believe Victoria completely. He was starting to understand exactly what that had cost him. The engagement party arrived 6 weeks later, a grand event inside the Sterling Imperial Ballroom, cameras outside, reporters, politicians, luxury investors. The official announcement of the union between Victoria Sterling and Alex Caldwell. What it was actually announcing was something Alex didn't fully understand until it was already happening around him. He was adjusting his tuxedo in the penthouse mirror when Victoria entered in a silver gown that shimmered like liquid. She looked perfect because she always looked perfect. That was the thing about Victoria. She was always ready, composed, emotionally unreachable. "You wanted this," she said softly, adjusting his tie. Alex stared at himself in the mirror. Did he? He'd been thinking about a name. Winthrop. He'd heard it 6 weeks ago from a gray-haired investor at a conference in Chicago, who'd approached him after a keynote and asked, with quiet curiosity, how Clara was doing. Alex had been confused. The man had handed him an invitation to a private charity gala. At the bottom, listed on the executive board, Clara Bennett Winthrop. Winthrop. As in Winthrop Global Developments. As in one of the most quietly powerful real estate dynasties in the country. Old money, private, enormous, the kind of wealth that doesn't need to announce itself because everything announces it for them. The investor had looked at him with something that wasn't quite pity. Then, "You really loved her without knowing who she was?" Alex had stood there speechless. "Then maybe you never deserved her." That sentence had been living inside Alex's chest ever since. And tonight it was getting louder. The ballroom filled with the most powerful people Alex had ever been in a room with. And then, maybe an hour in, the doors opened quietly. Clara walked in. Not the Clara from the apartment. Not the exhausted gallery worker in the simple dark red dress. This woman wore black couture, moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who has nothing left to prove, and was surrounded by people who, Alex watched it happen in real time. Powerful people stopped mid-sentence to acknowledge. Alex's first thought was simply that she looked different. His second thought, arriving immediately after, was that she didn't look different at all. She looked like herself, only undisguised. He'd seen this posture before, he'd just never understood what he was looking at. He'd seen it in the gallery when she moved through rooms, the way she never seemed to need anyone's approval to exist comfortably. He'd mistaken it for simplicity. It wasn't simplicity. It was something rarer. She wasn't performing confidence. She was just present. Completely, unhurriedly present. The way you are when you're not afraid of what the room thinks of you because the room, ultimately, is not the thing you care about. The people around her moved differently. Conversations paused. One European developer turned from a cluster of investors as if drawn by a sound below hearing range. A woman in diamonds touched her companion's arm and nodded subtly in Clara's direction. One developer whispered, "Winthrop." A billionaire across the room stood immediately. Clara walked through the ballroom the way you walk through a place you're not trying to impress. Calmly, quietly, without performance. She didn't look at Alex immediately. When she finally did, her eyes were completely clear. Not cold. Not warm. Just steady. The eyes of someone who had processed something fully and come out the other side of it. Alex felt the floor shift under him. Then an older man with silver hair walked beside Clara and stopped in front of Alex. The room quieted around them, almost involuntarily. "You must be Alex," the man said. "You're Clara's." Alex couldn't finish the sentence. "Father." Arthur Winthrop nodded once. "My daughter." Everything rearranged itself. Every memory of Clara reconstructed itself in Alex's mind, the modest apartment she'd chosen deliberately. The gallery job she could have walked away from any time. The quietness. The simplicity. The way she'd never once mentioned family money, never leaned on it, never used it to define herself. She'd hidden her world because she wanted to be loved without it. Because she'd wanted the truth of a person, not the performance. And Alex had failed that test as thoroughly as it could be failed. Arthur turned toward Victoria. Something in his expression made clear he'd been aware of her for a long time. I warned you years ago to stay away from my family. Victoria's composure held. This is business. No, Arthur said. This is obsession. He looked at Alex again. And you traded loyalty for vanity. The ballroom had gone completely silent. Investors were looking at each other. Executives shifting. Alex felt the specific social temperature that means rooms are making calculations. Then Arthur delivered the last thing. Our legal teams have recovered every unauthorized blueprint transfer connected to Sterling Global. Alex turned to Victoria instantly. Something behind her calm flickered. Not fear, Victoria didn't quite do fear, but the first readable expression he'd seen on her face in months. She was calculating her exit. Arthur continued, the acquisition strategy is finished. Investors peeled away from Victoria's orbit, quietly, efficiently, the way money moves when it senses structural failure. Not dramatically. Financially. Which is always more permanent. Alex looked at Clara across the room. She was watching him, and there was no satisfaction in her eyes. No victory. Just a kind of gentle, devastating accuracy. She saw exactly what had happened to him and exactly what it would cost. He crossed toward her, pulling her aside from the noise. I didn't know, he said. About who you were. I swear I didn't know. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, I know. She said it gently. That was the worst part. Because her gentleness told him everything, she wasn't protecting him from her anger. She genuinely had none left. She'd mourned him while he was still standing right next to her. The grief was already over, which meant there was nothing left to repair. I know you didn't know who I was, she said. But, Alex, you knew who you were becoming. And you chose it anyway. She walked back toward her father. And Alex stood in the middle of the ballroom, beneath the chandeliers, surrounded by people who were already rewriting their opinions of him, and understood that the disaster wasn't what had just happened tonight. The disaster was every choice he'd made for the last 2 years that had made tonight possible. The collapse came quickly after that, the way these things do once they start. What surprised Alex was how ordinary it looked from the outside. He'd imagined, on some level, that failure would arrive with the same volume as success. That there'd be a moment, a scene, something dramatic enough to match the drama of the rise. There wasn't. There was just the slow, quiet withdrawal of things. The magazine covers that had featured his face moved on to other faces. The investor dinners stopped being scheduled. His keynote invitations were politely deferred, calendar conflicts, which is what people say when they're recalculating your worth. The architecture board sent a letter using the word investigation in a way that made clear they were covering themselves regardless of outcome. A journalist who'd written a glowing profile of him 6 months ago now called his assistant, asking pointed questions about blueprint transfers and authorization chains. Magazines that had called him a visionary began running words like pawn and ethical questions. The waterfront project was frozen. His executive access was revoked. Victoria retreated into legal teams and damage control, shedding him with the clinical efficiency she brought to everything. Not cruelly, just practically, the way you close a program that stopped being useful. He stormed into her office one morning, slammed a newspaper on her desk. She glanced at the headline, kept reading her documents. You said we were building something together, he said. Victoria finally looked up. Alex. This was always business. You told me you believed in me. I believed you were useful. He stood there for a long moment. Useful. The word sat in the room like a verdict. You ruined my life, he said. No, Victoria said quietly. You ruined your life the moment applause became more important than loyalty. She looked back down at her documents. I just handed you the opportunity. The penthouse was Sterling Holdings' property. The movers arrived before he fully understood what was happening. Men in black uniforms carrying out artwork, disconnecting things, cataloging assets. A legal assistant informed him politely that he'd need to vacate by evening. He stood in the middle of those marble floors and looked around at everything he'd destroyed himself to obtain. None of it had ever been his. That was the final lesson. That night, sitting in the back of a taxi while rain streaked across Manhattan windows, Alex gave the driver an address before fully deciding to. The old apartment. The building looked smaller than he remembered. That's the thing about returning to the places that held your old life. They don't shrink, you just grew an inflated version of yourself that doesn't fit the same space anymore. The entrance had the same cracked tile. The elevator was still out of service in the same way it had always been out of service. The stairwell smelled the same. Old wood, someone cooking something in one of the lower apartments, the particular residential smell of many lives stacked on top of each other. He climbed slowly. 3rd floor. His breathing changed quality, became shallower. 4th floor. Apartment 4C. He stood in front of the door longer than he needed to. The paint was the same paint. The number was the same cheap pressed metal. He remembered the afternoon they'd moved in, carrying a mattress up the staircase together, laughing because it had gotten stuck on the 2nd floor landing for 20 minutes, Clara making up architectural explanations for the mattress's refusal to navigate a right angle. He still had the key. Some part of him had held onto it without making a decision to, the way you hold onto things when you're not ready to accept they're finished. He unlocked the door and stepped into the dark. Clara was gone. Completely gone. No furniture, no photographs, no trace of the life they'd shared except the things too small to bother removing. The faint outline of their old couch against the wall. Tiny nail holes where she'd hung art she found at street markets. A coffee stain on the kitchen counter they'd laughed about for 2 years. Alex walked through slowly. Sat down on the empty floor by the window. The city glowed outside. Rain tapped against the glass. He thought about the soup crackers. About her holding them up like she'd won something. About the proposal on the sidewalk, when he'd meant every word. About the fact that she'd spent 2 years believing in him with a ferocity he'd eventually found more inconvenient than comforting. He thought about what the investor in Chicago had said. You really loved her without knowing who she was? Maybe you never deserved her. And then the wind came through the open balcony door. Wind chimes. Small, silver, cheap ones Clara had bought from a street vendor one afternoon while they were killing time between job applications. Even cheap things can sound beautiful, she'd said. Alex sat on the empty floor while those tiny chimes moved in the wind, and he cried. Not dramatically, not loudly, the way you cry when the thing you're grieving is yourself. The version of yourself that existed before you chose ambition over the only person who ever loved you without needing anything back. Clara had believed he was going to become something incredible. She was right. She just didn't know what kind of something. The chimes kept moving. The city kept going. The apartment stayed empty around him. And the saddest thing, the thing that will follow Alex Caldwell for a long time, is that Clara wasn't even thinking about him anymore. She'd already let him go. Long before the engagement party. Long before the phone she found in his jacket. Long before he stood at a microphone and announced to a room full of strangers that love was an emotional limitation. She had loved him at his worst and believed in him before he'd earned it. And the day he stopped valuing that, the ending had already been written. He just didn't know it yet. There's a version of this story where Alex Caldwell learns from it and becomes someone better. Where the loss of Clara and the collapse of everything he traded her for rebuilds him into a man with actual priorities. Maybe that version is even true. Maybe somewhere beyond this ending, he becomes someone worth being. But that story, if it exists, doesn't begin yet. It begins after the night on the empty floor. After the wind chimes stop. After he's finally sat still long enough with the silence to stop running from what it contains. After he's honest with himself about every choice, not just the dramatic ones at the ballroom microphone, but the small quiet daily choices that got him there. The first night he put ambition before her comfort. The first time he felt embarrassed by her presence. The first moment he prioritized applause over the woman who'd been applauding him since before anyone else had reason to. He'd once told Clara, kneeling on a rain-soaked sidewalk, "If I ever become anything in this world, it'll be because you loved me first." He became something. She loved him first. And he learned, much too late, that those two facts were never independent of each other.